This is George Gruhn from Gruhn Guitars for our weekly Friday noon question and answer session. As usual, we have a bunch of good questions already and more coming in, and I'll try to get as many done as possible. Gruhn Guitars is open to the public in the showroom by appointment, and we're able to take a pretty good number of walk-in, just random show up as well if you ring the doorbell. We are practicing social spacing, so we keep some limitations on how many people at a time can be in the showroom, but nobody's had to wait terribly long to get in. We just request that people come with a face mask and observe normal social spacing in our COVID-19 pandemic. But so far, we've all maintained good health, and business has been good. So at any rate, we are pleased to be here and ready to help people. If they just show up and ring the doorbell, we're ready. And obviously, if somebody has questions, they can call the shop number, 615-256-2033. The regular email, gruhn@gruhn.com, and my personal email, george@guitars.com, GUITARS.com. That web domain cost about $30 when we got it, and people ask sometimes, how could you do that for that price? And the answer is, I'm old, so I was there first. At any rate, I'd like to start today by showing a guitar that we can chat about for a minute. We have right back here, Martin guitar. Martin, on their peg head on the new guitars, has C.F. Martin and Company EST for established 1833. And C.F. Martin Sr. and his wife and Louis Schmidt, one of their employees, came over on a boat from Germany, went to New York City in 1833, and by early 1834, they were busy building guitars. And they moved to Nazareth, Pennsylvania in 1839, but they continued to stamp these instruments, C.F. Martin, New York, because they used New York distributors, and did not go to actually stamping them Nazareth, Pennsylvania until 1898. This is a guitar made in 1842. Still has that Martin traditional squared off peg head, which interestingly enough is the idea that Martin actually borrowed from Spanish makers in Cadiz, such as Reyes, and has friction pegs. They offered the choice at that time and even into the early 1900s of geared pegs or friction pegs. Most of the Martins of the pre-1929 period have a slotted peg head similar to a classical guitar, but they typically were not truly a modern style classical. The Martin guitars prior to the early 1920s were designed for gut strings. Today, we would typically string one of those with nylon, but nylon wasn't around until after World War II. On this guitar, it's a kind of deluxe instrument. You can see some close-up features, nice inlay on the sound hole, interesting wide binding on the edge of the peg head, white bindings on the body, fancy wood marquetry on the back and down the center of the sides. And the sides are actually two-piece book matched, the top and back. So it not only has a book matched two-piece back, but it has two-piece sides. This is a feature also copied from the Spaniards. And the body shape is a Spanish design, not the Torres design of the more modern classical, the earlier Spanish classicals. This has a tie-on classical style bridge without bridge pins, although most of the Martins of this period had bridge pins. Bridge pins do not indicate that a guitar was designed for steel strings. It simply is that bridge pins with typical Germanic and French style, whereas the Spanish design generally had tie-on like this. This also has a fan bracing pattern rather than X bracing, although Martin had X bracing, for which they're famous, as early as 1841, a year before this guitar. This guitar has 5 fans in exactly the same pattern as some of the small body guitars by Torres of Spain. So this has a fan bracing pattern 10 years before Torres. So Martin was an innovative builder, but they were also a copier in some ways too. Because when Martin came from Germany to the US, he followed the design patterns of his mentor and who he had worked for in Vienna for 10 years, which was Stauffer, Johann Stauffer of Vienna, where Martin worked prior to coming to the US. And this guitar is more influenced by Spanish guitars, such as performers were using. Some Spanish players, including Madame de Gonay, came from Spain and toured and played in New York. And this influenced the people there who wanted guitars. And these early Martins were made primarily for classical playing. This was not a folky instrument. This was a serious classical instrument at the time. And Martin guitars were priced accordingly. This was not something that amateur ethnic folk musicians were buying. Martin was the first known American guitar maker. Not that he was American in the sense of having been born here, but he was at least living in New York and did become an American citizen. So the origins of guitar in America basically can be traced to Martin. And Martin is today still one of the largest volume makers of high quality guitars. Right now they may be vying for that title with Taylor, as to who makes the most. Taylor's been around since 1974. At any rate, this is a guitar that we are proud to have been able to restore. It's in fine condition now. Needed some work before it was in good playing order, but it is now in fine playing order. And everything on it that looks white is genuine ivory. This has fine Adirondack spruce, Brazilian rosewood back and sides, Spanish cedar neck, and Spanish cedar is a wood that's native to Brazil, but it smells much like cedar, although it isn't true cedar. It's more related to mahogany. It's called Spanish cedar because it smells like cedar, and the Spaniards used it to make guitar necks. So much for that. This is a guitar plenty good for show and tell time, and plenty good as a wonderful piece of history, and is a fine quality instrument. And it shows the origins of Martin, that during the 1900s, Martin started introducing steel strings in the 1920s, but the basic design concepts for the modern Martin guitars can still be clearly seen in this instrument. They evolve over time. Going on now to questions from listeners. We have one, Ralph Kurtenbach from last week's chat. Which models of Gibsons did George just critique? The ones with robot tuners. Well, the robot tuners were on a wide variety of Gibsons, particularly in the year 2015, and I was critical of them. It's not just that the robot tuners were troublesome and that most people didn't like them. They often enough were troublesome so far as functioning well, but they were also clunky looking, they were heavy, and they often didn't work well. But the guitars had strange neck dimensions and electronics. It was not printed circuitry that you couldn't change pickups to anything else. The guitars were a dismal failure and cost Gibson a great deal of money. Marty Evans. We all know and expect that over time, most guitars will need a neck reset. Do different scale length pressures have an effect on the time it takes to need a reset, short scale versus long scale? Also, do different fretboard materials make a difference strength-wise, with the strongest possibly delaying the need for a neck set? This question applies primarily to acoustic guitars. Electric guitars are much more stable, particularly solid body guitars. The body is not likely to warp over time due to string tension. And the reason for a neck set typically is not that the neck warped, but that the body warped slightly with string tension over time. And rather than scale length being a critical factor, it is true there's a bit more tension with a long scale versus short, but string gauge probably is more significant even than scale lengths as far as how much tension there is. A set of light gauge steel strings puts considerably less tension on a guitar than a set of mediums or heavy gauge. But the fingerboard material does have an impact on stability of neck. Ebony or Brazilian rosewood is quite strong and resistant to warpage, but neck warpage is not why guitars typically will need a neck set. And if a neck warps, that's still a problem independent of neck set. Neck set is a problem to deal with when the body has warped a bit, resulting in a changed neck angle due to that, whereas a neck warp or twist is something that really needs attention to the neck itself, and that is not impacting the neck set angle. You don't correct a warped neck by resetting the neck. You have to straighten the neck, or at least have proper relief in the neck. If the neck is absolutely straight, strings will buzz. You need a little bit of concavity to it to have proper dimension, proper playability. But at any rate, neck warpage is totally independent of neck set angle. Typically, most acoustic guitars after 30 or 40 years are likely, due to string tension, to have some neck set angle shift. And depending on how much it is, you may be able to just adjust the saddle, or if more so, you may have to do a neck set. But again, adjustable truss rods, or adjustable truss rods don't correct neck set. And if a guitar doesn't have an adjustable truss rod and is a neck relief problem, it may require a plain and refret. That's a totally different situation than neck set. Larry, in the late 1960s, Gretsch put out a Monkees version, hollow body. Can you comment on its quality? I am led to believe it is an excellent guitar, but at the time, collectors or musicians dismissed it because the Monkees initially did not play their own instruments on the recordings. Well, it is true that the Monkees didn't, at least at first, play their own music, and they were basically a put-together band for a TV show, and they hired musicians who could play some, but were also actors. And so it was a sort of synthetic put-together band, but later they got to be more and more of a real band. The Monkees model has the Monkees logo on the pick guard, and the quality is the same as other hollow body Gretsch guitars of the time. 16-inch wide, double cutaway, hollow body, and has two Supertron pickups similar to the Filtertron. So far as sound, it's a pretty good Gretsch sound, very similar to the ones such as the Chet Atkins models with the Filtertrons. The Supertrons sound slightly different, but even some Chet models featured Supertrons country gentleman during the 60s for a while had Supertron rhythm pickup and Filtertron lead pickup. So you can still get a good sound, and the Monkees was a good guitar, relatively rare and not tremendously sought after today, but still a good utility guitar with some collectible appeal. DB, what instruments were you able to restore after the Nashville flood, and were there any of note that made it back? In general, we didn't get much on restoration work other than some from the Roy Acuff collection, which was severely damaged in the flood. And we did restore one of the early New York stamp Martins for him. Actually, it wasn't really for Roy per se. Roy was no longer involved in 2010. But by that time, Roy was already dead, but the museum was still intact, but had been in storage for a while. And there was just tremendous damage. The acoustic instruments damaged in the flood, if they were underwater for a few days, were in general usually total basket cases that would have cost multiples more than the instrument was worth to try to put it back together, and the result would not have been good. Primarily the ones that were salvaged were solid body electrics, especially Fender guitars. The Fender guitars have no bindings on the body to come loose, and in general they survived submersion water far better than guitars with glued on bindings, and especially hollow instruments with tops, back, sides, and bracing interior. Those things, especially if they were under tension, the strings, when they got wet, everything came apart and warped, and for the most part, those things were not restorable. So there was a great loss. Fortunately, most of the instruments damaged in that flood of 2010 were utility tools rather than great collectibles, but there was still significant loss of collectibles as well, but not near as many. The Acuff Collection, in my opinion, being the biggest single loss. Most of the Acuff instruments were totally beyond restoration. And that I do view as a tragedy. But Gruhn guitars did not do a great deal of restoration after the flood. Ron Kaufman, I own a 1978 Gibson S1. I can't remember why I sold it. I think I got a black Les Paul custom afterward. I have started to shop for used S1, and I'm a little surprised at the values. Can you tell me the history of the guitar and why Gibson discontinued it? Was the idea to compete with the Fender Strat? Are you seeing strong numbers for these guitars today? They seem to be pretty hard to find. There are lots of parts available. Does that mean they just didn't hold up? This is a model that was made from about 1976 through 1980. It had a body shaped like a Les Paul, but it had a bolt-on neck with a pointed shaped peg head, almost like a flying V peg head. It had 3 single coil Bill Lawrence design pickups that were set in clear epoxy. Had a 4-position pickup selector switch. It was a relatively inexpensive model when new. The current Vintage Guitar Magazine 2020 price guide shows them $850 to $1,100. We don't see very many of them. They didn't sell very well when new. They didn't make a whole lot as a consequence. And do I see them as being a great collectible? No. It's a utility tool. And do I think it's as good as a standard Les Paul model? No. Is it a model that I would personally want? No. Is it a utility tool that's usable? Yes, it's usable, but uninspiring. And I do not anticipate them becoming great collectibles. And if somebody's asking a great deal more than VG price guide indicates, well, asking and getting are not the same. So just the fact that somebody may list one at more doesn't necessarily mean that asking and getting will be equivalent. Bob Ray, in the past I bought Gibson, Gallagher, and Martin acoustic guitars from you. The Gallagher GC 70 I bought from you in 1982 became my primary instrument. My question is how you store your collected guitars. Do you maintain A440 tuning or loosen the strings while the guitars are stored and not being played regularly? Also, what about the use of case humidifiers? Well, if you're planning on not playing an instrument for months on end, or possibly even years on end, you may want to just leave it in the case, but if you leave it tuned up and you're not inspecting it regularly, there's always the potential that something may come loose and you haven't checked it lately, and when you finally open up the case, a great deal of damage has been done. There's really no reason to have an acoustic guitar tuned to full tension if you're not planning to play it for months on end. It's better for the instrument to keep the strings slack if you're not going to use it for long periods of time. And it's also far safer if you're not checking it regularly to not have tension on it. The other part of this question about case humidifiers, if you're not checking them regularly, are likely to run dry. Ultimately, it's far better to just humidify the room or humidify your whole house. Guitars like the same temperature and humidity that people do. 45 to 50% humidity is just great. And normal room temperature, but really anything over 50 and typically under 80 is going to be just fine. If you take a guitar and put it in the trunk of your car and you're out in Chicago visiting friends overnight and you leave your guitar there at -20, that's not good for it. And if you leave it down here in the summertime, when it's 95 degrees outside and the sun's beating down on your car, so it's 140 inside the car, if a child or pet would die if left in that situation, don't expect your instrument to do well either. So if guitars are not being checked regularly, there's no reason to keep it in tune if you're not playing it for the next year. It's far better to detune it, leave it slack, and humidifiers in cases are only effective when they're inspected frequently, but ultimately it's so much better to just humidify the house or the room. And you too will feel better, because if humidity in your house is under 20%, your nasal passages will crack. You'll be more susceptible to getting the flu and getting colds. Your health will be better, and so will your guitar. Kurt Jakely, you have incredible knowledge and experience with Martin instruments regarding the choices that Martin has made for woods and soundboards, necks, backs, sides, braces, bridge plates. Maybe you can walk through some of the history since the early days to the present and what influenced those changes. Well, Martin has been fairly consistent over the years, but having been in business since 1833, needless to say, times have changed, and availability of some materials has changed, and also the basic design of the instruments, where the early ones were for gut strings and the later ones today are primarily for steel strings, has changed. Martin didn't have adjustable truss rods in the neck until 1985, but they did start putting a steel T-bar in the necks in late 1934. But since very early in Martin's history, rosewood back and sides had been on most of their high-end instruments. Prior to late 1969, it was generally Brazilian rosewood. Adirondack spruce was the primary spruce Martin used until 1945, when they started making the transition to Sitka spruce, and by 46 that had been pretty well done thoroughly, so that virtually everything from 46 onward is Sitka spruce, with the exception of some custom shop instruments. So even today, they are using Adirondack spruce on many custom order instruments and on their authentic series instruments. Spanish cedar, which I talked about earlier in this session, it was the typical neck wood on most Martin guitars through 1917, and mahogany for most Martin necks after that. Brazilian rosewood has been used on fingerboards on some of the lesser, or say the economy models, up through about 1940 on most Martins, but not all. And ebony on the higher grade models. And today, ebony is still used on the high grade models. And actually today, on most of the USA made Martins, with the exception of style 15s, 16s, and 17s, today most of the lower end Martins are Indian rosewood and the high end ones are ebony. But bracing pattern, they've been doing X bracing since 1841. But there's scallop braces typically through late 1938, and then non-scalloped after that. For a while, late 60s on into the early 80s, they were mid 80s actually, they were using rosewood bridge plates, but for the rest of the time, it's generally been maple bridge plates. And today, Martin does a lot of their guitars with scalloped bracing, but not all. So there's dozens and dozens of different model Martins and hundreds of variations over the years. There are good books available. Martin offers these books, and we have a good selection of books on Martin guitars here at the shop. But there's enough knowledge about Martins that it is well documented. Martin has accurate records going as far back as their early days of the 1830s, but unfortunately their 1840s ledger book disappeared years ago. But with the exception of the missing 1840s ledger book, most of it is extremely well documented, and there's even a good bit of documentation for the 40s, 1840s. Richard Dodson, I had a custom shop model 0042 made with premium Madagascar rosewood in 2008. I had several Martin guitars, and this one does sound quite good. I was curious status, availability of this wood, thoughts on this wood in general, and what wood care and hardwood products do you recommend? Madagascar rosewood looks closer to Brazilian rosewood than almost any other rosewood, but it is actually softer and a bit more flexible. So far as sound, it's not the same as Brazilian. It's very good, but it's not identical. And in my opinion, sonically, Madagascar rosewood does not, especially to my ear, sound any better than a good piece of Indian rosewood. There's also other South American and Central American rosewoods. There's a lot of species in the genus Dalbergia. Dalbergia nigra is Brazilian rosewood. There's other species in Brazil, but the one commonly called Brazilian rosewood that Martin used over many, many years is Dalbergia nigra. But Guatemalan rosewood is very good. Cocobolo is good. There's a variety of rosewoods. But the honest fact is that, in my opinion, almost any of the rosewoods can give a good sound. But to get really great sound, it is important to couple it with the right wood for the back and sides. And Adirondack spruce is what Martin used pre-World War II. And I'm firmly of the opinion that Adirondack spruce is a critical component of the sound. You can build a good sounding guitar with a wide variety of different woods, but the wood of the back and sides does have a significant impact on sound. And for that matter, so does the wood on the neck. A lot of sound is transmitted through the neck. So that when it comes right down to it, you can get a custom shop guitar made with Indian rosewood and still get great sound. But if you want the prettiest wood, Brazilian is gorgeous, Madagascar is beautiful wood, but Madagascar is a country that is ecologically very, very much in danger. And there's quite a bit of regulation now internationally on any products coming from Madagascar that are plant and animal related. Every species native to Madagascar is in danger because the entire ecosystem is in danger. So there's a lot of Madagascar reptiles and some amphibians that are popular as pets, but it is best to get captive bred ones rather than imports. The Madagascar tortoises are incredibly endangered, as are many of the Madagascar snakes and mammals, lemurs. Madagascar are all endangered. There's hardly any ecosystem in the world that is more endangered than Madagascar. And from a satellite picture, you can see a brown ring around the island, which is a sign of tremendous erosion and horrible practices of ecological destruction. So again, Madagascar rosewood is in short supply, and I don't think sonically it's necessarily better. TT, what wood care hardwood products do you recommend? What's your favorite guitar, and has that choice evolved over the years? How do you see the music business evolving post-pandemic, guitar sales, collecting, and playing? Well, it's multiple questions, but wood care and hardwood product cares, products, we don't really see much need for most of them. We're not recommending a whole bunch of goop to put on fingerboards. Occasionally, if they're really dried out, a bit of linseed oil, but that's usually not necessary. So far as polishing products, almost any good non-silicone polish works fine, but you don't want something that seeps into the wood and penetrates and permanently alters the composition of the finish. And you have to be careful in cleaning if you're cleaning something with a French polish finish. French polish and varnish is often not compatible with anything that has the least bit of alcohol. So if you're using hand sanitizer, you sure don't want to get that on a French polish finish. It'll dissolve your finish. If you have a polyurethane finish, that's pretty much impervious to almost anything. But in general, there's not very much that goes on with the guitar that an ever so slightly damp cloth won't clean off. But again, good guitar polishes, Martin and others do have some good guitar polishes available. But typically, if you wash your hands and don't just get grunge all over your guitar, there's not much that a just slightly damp cloth won't fix. If you sweat all over it, that's not really good for guitars. But some people just don't treat their guitars very well. My favorite guitar, I've said it a number of times on this type presentation. I have a 1929 Gibson L5 that I love. I've had L5 guitars since the 1920s, or made in the 1920s, but not since me owning it. My first one was a 1924 Lohr signed Gibson L5, which I sold back in the mid-'80s when I was having financial tax problems, when prime rate interest was 20%, and I wish I had the guitar back. But right now I have a 29 L5, just like Maybelle Carter's, and I like it as well as any I've ever played. But the 16-inch wide L5s made in the 1920s are my favorite arch tops, and my favorite flat tops tend to be Martin D and triple O size guitars made between 1934 and late 1938. And they had forward shifted scallop bracing, Adirondack spruce, and they're just great guitars. Style 28s, 42 and 45s in particular are things that I'm very, very fond of. How do I see the music business evolving post-pandemic, guitar sales, collecting, and playing? Well, while the pandemic is a big deal right now, rightfully so, at some point, we're going to get beyond that, hopefully, with the vaccine. What we're not going to get beyond is the fact of demographic shift. And that, I think, is a very significant factor. I was born in 1945. I'll be 75 years old in August 21st. I grew up revering vintage instruments, particularly though at a time when the new ones were pretty poor comparatively. Today, the new guitars are far better than the ones made 50 years ago, which was 1970. The 70s were not the best. A lot of the younger players today are not very familiar with vintage, and even if they are, they couldn't afford some of them. So they're playing newer ones, and the newer ones today are stage-worthy, good quality instruments, at least the ones from the major makers. So what's really changing over time is availability of some materials such as Brazilian rosewood, just good quality tropical forest hardwoods in general are becoming more and more endangered. And also the demographics of the market are shifting. Not everybody even is interested these days in playing vintage guitars or playing guitars at all. If you're into rap or hip hop, you may not even use guitar. But I can't tell you what's going to be popular 50 years from now. What I can tell you is that I expect the guitar to still be around and be strong 50 years from now. But I can't tell you what quality new ones will be 50 years from now. Hopefully Martin, Gibson, Fender, and Taylor will all still be in business, even though different people will be making them. And I'm not going to be here 50 years from now to view it. At least not very likely. There'll have to be some very major advance in medicine before I could expect to live another 50. But at any rate, times do change. But I expect that guitar will remain popular, and I've yet to see any new one that beats the true golden era classic era, say. I'm not talking about classical guitar as classical music, but the great golden era of acoustic guitars, the 1920s and 30s for steel string guitars, and the great golden era for electric guitars of the 1950s through the early 1960s. I haven't seen anything that beats that, but I certainly see new ones that approach it and new ones that are absolutely stage worthy. Walt Wixner, I'd like to ask about bellying up on acoustic guitars. I see some old Gibson, an old 1955 country western, and is bellying up an easy fix? Well, bellying up behind the bridge is a matter of string tension over the years, pulling up, and especially if any braces come loose. If a brace is loose, that thing can really belly up badly. And this is something that definitely needs attention. A very slight amount of bellying up is normal over time, but eventually will result in needing a neck set to compensate. They often not only belly up behind the bridge, but they sink a bit from the fingerboard extension over the top from the sound hole on up to the neck joint. They'll sink inward, and often in front of the bridge, between the bridge and the sound hole, they'll sink down a bit and belly up behind the bridge. The string tension is pulling it into a bit of an S curve. The function of bracing is to keep it as strong as possible. If you build braces too heavy, they may be structurally more stable, except that the top won't vibrate. So there's this delicate balance of structural stability and ability to vibrate and produce good quality sound. But again, it is possible for a skilled repairman to work on that and get considerable improvement. Sometimes too, the bridge plate may be a problem if it is cracked or broken, and will also contribute to bellying up. But again, we do this type of work routinely at our shop, and obviously other skilled repair people do, but on each guitar, it's often a different problem causing it. So what I can say is if things are bellying up significantly behind the bridge, step one is immediately loosen the strings and take it to a highly qualified, good repairman. It's not the average neighborhood music store often enough. It requires real skill, but this is something that does need attention because it will get worse and can cause severe damage if not attended to. Last question from TT, by the way, was what do you think about the late 1970s Les Paul Custom? And I think that those are good utility tools. I don't expect them to become great collectibles. I don't expect them to appreciate more than the standard rate of inflation, but they're good utility tools. Avid, well, it just says, this is, I guess, not the name of the person, it just says avid listener. I've searched your website inventory a couple of times recently for Gibson V, Gibson Modernistic guitars, and 1960s Dan Electro Longhorn guitars, and haven't seen any listed. Would you comment on these guitars and their collectability? The Dan Electro guitars of the 50s through early 60s, or into the 60s, are particularly the Longhorn models, are rather collectible, but it's the sort of kitschy collectibles. Are they, in my opinion, as good as a old Flying V Gibson? No, but still a Longhorn may bring a couple $1,000s. And they did make a model that not only had the dramatic deep cutaways, but had lots of extra frets that you could play on up into mandolin range. So you could play it all the way from guitar range to mandolin range. But as far as exactly how really useful that was, that's debatable, because having good action and really good tone and those extreme upper registers on that was iffy. So far as the Gibson Modernistic guitars, that would consist of the V, the Explorer, and the Modern. No evidence that any real Moderns were made in 58 or 59, but the Vs and Explorers certainly were. We don't get very many of them. They're exceedingly scarce to get the originals, and they bring huge money in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But there are plenty of V, Explorer, and Modern reissue models. And again, we don't get a whole lot of them here. The fact that we haven't had any lately doesn't mean we don't want them. It's just we have whatever we've been able to get recently. So what we have and what we wish we had are not always the same thing. We strive to get a good selection, but with new instruments, you can pick up the phone and you order from the maker, and you order in the quantities that you hope to sell. And that's a great thing. But with vintage and used, you have what you can find at the time. And if something is in high demand, one reason why we may not have very many is that the moment they come in, they go out. And sometimes what we have a lot of is things that may actually be in lower demand, so that when they come in, they sit longer. So you can't judge how desirable something is by a dealer's stock of used instruments. They have what they could get, and they also have what is still there and didn't sell overnight when it first came in. Joe, regarding the reincarnation of D'Angelico guitars, which this week acquired the Supro name, do you consider the company a blight on the name, or do you think there's a good place in the world for such a product? Well, there may be a good place in the world for their guitars, but do I think that John D'Angelico himself, if he were resurrected today, would be happy to see his name used on Asian imports that don't really resemble what he designed, except for the peghead shape and name on the peghead? The one-word answer is no. And D'Angelico himself would probably have some expletives in front of the word no if he could be asked his opinion, but he died in 1964, so he can't voice an opinion on that. But there are plenty of cases in which names have gone into public domain that they were registered but then lapsed and hadn't been in production for many years, and names have been resurrected. Even Supro was a Valco brand name made by the same company that was producing the National Electric guitars. And Supros were a budget brand back in the 1950s and early 60s. But these names some of them have simply been bought, like Regal, Harmony, and Kay. These names are still in use, but they have no real direct relationship to the original company. And so that's throughout the music industry, we find names that had gone into disuse, which is like Recording King was a Montgomery Ward brand name for guitars that were made for them by Regal and some models by Gibson. But today, Recording King guitars are made in China, and it's unrelated to the original ownership. But that's about as much as I can easily say on that topic. Alan, what is a good resource I can use when looking to purchase a vintage instrument, specifically a Martin D18? Something that will identify features about the instrument that could validate its authenticity and highlight any modifications. Is it best to just trust a professional like yourself or attempt on my own with an appraisal before purchase? Well, we might liken this in some ways to purchasing a fine piece of art, such as, suppose you're a billionaire and you'd like to have a Van Gogh painting, or something by Da Vinci, or Michelangelo, or Rembrandt, or Picasso, whatever. For every one that's real of those type paintings, there's a whole lot of forgeries, and you have to know a great deal. If you're buying one of those from a person who is if you find it at the flea market and you think it might be real, if you know enough that you yourself are an art expert, you might buy it, especially if it's priced at a bargain, but you better know a lot before you invest thousands of dollars. There's not a whole lot of forgeries of D18s, but there certainly are lots of gradations of condition. And if you're not highly knowledgeable yourself, it is certainly a lot safer to deal with a reputable dealer who will give you a certificate of authenticity and somebody who's going to be there to be able to stand behind it. If the dealer is somebody you don't know and aren't sure how much you trust, if it's sent to you on approval or given to you on approval for long enough that you can take it to a reputable, good third-party appraiser, that is an advisable thing to do. You know, we at Gruhn Guitars do have an appraisal service, and we frequently do appraisals for people who are thinking of buying an instrument. We are not the only appraiser out there, needless to say, and I'm not going to claim that we're the only reputable dealer out there either. There are a number of good dealers out there whose word is good, but trust but verify. That was something Ronald Reagan said. I don't subscribe to much of his politics otherwise, but trust but verify is a good thing. And when we sell an instrument, we do provide a certificate of authenticity on request. And we are effectively putting our reputation behind that. And if a dealer is unwilling to provide a statement of authenticity, that's a big red flag. Not all dealers, though, are equally knowledgeable. If you find something in a pawn shop, it may be the real deal, but you'd better get a good inspection by somebody who is highly knowledgeable. If you want to learn, that's great, but this is something I've been studying since 1963. And Joe Spann, who works with me on appraisals, has spent over 40 years studying particularly Gibson history, but history of guitars, banjos, and mandolins in general. There isn't any one book that is going to be at all equivalent. And in fact, everything that's in a lot of those books has also been studied carefully by some people who are less honest, and they have been doing everything they could to produce fakes or to modify an instrument in such a manner that it might look better than it is. You may take a D28 and spruce it up to look like a style 42 or 45. Or you may have the real deal, but it may have had some extensive repair work, which if it's well enough done, might be almost invisible, but still things like a broken peg head had better be revealed because it is important on the valuation of the instrument. We do have instruments that we've restored extensively. Even the Martin 1842 guitar I showed earlier today is something that we did quite a bit of restoration work on, but we do disclose what we've done. But as I said, there's quite a few books available. I don't have time to go through all of them at this point, but the Martin Company offers some good books. We have all of those same books and others here. And these books are readily available. So you can spend years studying, but years of study will not necessarily mean that you know as much as we or other appraisers know. Deal with people that you trust, and if you're dealing with somebody you don't fully trust, then get a good third-party appraisal, which can be just as good as dealing with somebody that you trust. You don't have to always trust who you're dealing with if you verify independently. When I'm buying instruments myself, we go through them, give them the complete forensic exam up in the repair shop upstairs, as well as me eyeballing it. And we go, we match it up to company records when possible, but we study it with care. We want to know what it is. We want to know the history of that instrument insofar as a forensic exam can tell us. A good forensic exam can tell quite a bit. Charlie, the 1960 Fender Deluxe is a different transformer than the Deluxe amps of the 50s. Different form, function, and tone perspective. I'm not a great amp expert. I'll probably have to get to that one next week. And I will make a point of getting to that with my other folks here because I don't claim to know everything. When I become omniscient, I'll let everybody know right away, but in the meantime, I'm not, which is one reason why I have a good staff. But he does have a further question. Can you tell us about all the little subtle differences between a 1952 Blackguard Telly and a 1955 Blackguard Telly? Well, I'm not sure I can tell you about all the little subtle differences because that would imply that I'm omniscient and I know everything. But I can tell you first, they didn't make any Blackguards in 55. By that time, they were doing White Guards. The White Guard came out in late 54. But a 52 Blackguard will have a butterscotch blonde finish, whereas a 55 model will have a more ivory white finish. Still transparent, but different color. The early Fenders had more differences, but in 52, the pickup had level pole bars. 55, early in the year, still has the level pole bars, but by later in the year, they have staggered height poles, and they sound different. But the primary differences you'll see right away will be in the color of the pick guard, white versus black, And the pole bars on the pickup, also early 52, will have the different wiring scheme where there's a blend control rather than a tone control. And there's a capacitor for the rhythm pickup that made it sound very muddy and very deep bass. And it was the idea that Leo had to play bass lines on it. And by late 52, they had done away with that. So it makes quite a difference there. He says, and why do you think the broadcaster wiring was never on the tellies after 1950? Well, 1950 was broadcaster, not telly. They didn't come up with the telly name until 1951. And, but it was in 52, as I said, that the blend control ended. But the muddy sound on those early broadcasters and the early tellies was really Leo's idea that you could play bass lines on it. And they gave up on that pretty soon, so that by late 52, they had the more modern type wiring, which suits guitar players in general much better. Also, the early broadcasters have steel saddles, but by late 1950, they had brass saddles. And by late 1954, Fender was back to steel saddles rather than brass. So there are those subtle changes over the years, and some of those changes, I guess, wouldn't even be all that subtle. They sound and look different. So to me, the finest sounding Fender tellies ever made are those 52 and 3 tellies with the black guard. And to me, those guitars are still magic. But the pickups were hand wound, and the amount of windings on the bridge position pickup varied very considerably. And the ones that were fatter, you can even see it visually. Some were just almost bulging on that bobbin, and others had room to spare for more windings. Generally, I like the ones that have lots of winding and are really very powerful sounding, but they have an almost acoustic quality of tones as far as their tonal range. Their harmonic range is remarkably similar to a good acoustic guitar in tonal range. They're amazingly good guitars. Bob Frank, I own a 62 reissue Stratocaster in shell pink, one of the Japanese models, vintage series. I believe there are quite a few reissues of this color, but I've never seen an original 62 in shell pink. I've searched Google, but never even been able to find a photo of one or a sales record of a Strat in this color. My question is, has a 62 Strat in shell pink ever come through your shop? And did they actually make any in that color? Well, that color was available from 60 through 62, but it's one of the absolute rarest of any of the Fender colors. And yes, we've had one, but I'd have to go back in my records to see how many years ago it was. I think it was probably over 20 years ago. So it's extremely rare, to the point where I'm not able to tell you how many were made, but I can certainly say that I'm not anticipating seeing a bunch of them anytime soon. That's a very, very rare beast. Doug has a question. I follow online guitar groups, and occasionally someone posts a guitar, vintage or otherwise, online. I look these up and compare the asking price with my vintage guitar catalog assessment. In your opinion, does the vintage guitar catalog, and he's referring to the Vintage Guitar Magazine price guide, have a pretty good approximation of general price ranges on most good quality guitars? Well, I think pretty good approximation, general price bracket on most good quality acoustic guitars. Well, in general, on the ones that are not too terribly rare, the answer is pretty good, but I'm not always in agreement. But on extremely rare, obscure models, often not so good at all. On makers that are obscure, for example, not Strats or Tellys, but if you get into Larson Brothers of Chicago, which is a maker I very much like, that is much more difficult. And I also find that their prices on Epiphone acoustic arch tops, I disagree with vehemently. I think they greatly undervalue them. And what's more, I'm easily able to get higher prices than they have listed in that guide. And I wish I could buy some at the prices they have in that guide in that particular example. But overall, on the more well-known models, they're pretty good, but it's still like a price if you had a ticker tape on a stock market printed once a year, giving you 6-month-old information at the time. You wouldn't like to trade stocks or bonds that way. The book is printed once a year, and they have to have a printer assemble it, but before that, they have to get the information, arrange it all. They spend a few months putting all that together, and then it has to go to a printer, and then it has to get distributed. And also, if you buy the book in mid-year, that's already year-old information. So that right now, the Vintage Guitar Magazine price guide, here we are in the 6th month of the year, and the information is probably a year old. But if you buy the book, they do give you an online access. If you buy it, they give you a code number that you can check online. But you can also go to Reverb and you can check their prices. But again, Reverb, a lot of times those prices don't reflect how much a really good one will bring. The value of the guitar has a lot to do not only with the make, model, and year, but the condition. And just the fact that something sold for price X doesn't mean that, in my opinion, that it was a good deal at that price. Or if somebody got a really great deal, that also can reflect where I don't trust price guides, and I don't price my instruments based on simply looking things up. I will look and see what others have to say, but ultimately I will also depend to a large extent on my own personal experience dealing and collecting from '63 to the present and running the shop from '70 to the present. T or B, Tar, can you talk about Martin's foray into archtop guitars? Well, archtop guitars were increasing in popularity in the '30s. In 1931, Martin decided they would get into that, but they didn't really try to copy Epiphone or Gibson or D'Angelico or others that were doing carved backs and carved tops. They did carved tops, but they otherwise put those tops onto what was otherwise a standard flat top guitar design. So their neck did not have a fingerboard elevated off the top. They had regular flat top guitar type back, and the neck set angle was done to accommodate a tall arch top guitar style movable bridge and that arch top, so that the neck set angle was so steep that if you put a guitar on the floor or on a table, it would rest on the tip end of the peg head on the tip, the edge of the body at the butt end, so you would only have 2 contact points or 2 contact lines, the line at the end of the peg head and the line at the bottom edge of the body, and the rest would be entirely arched off the floor or the table. They made the R size, which was based on the 00 size body form, for the same as a 00 flat top body shape and size. Did the C that was the same as the 000 size. And then in 1935, they came out with the F size, which was 16 inches wide. And they made no flat top equivalent, but they made those from 35 to 42. And in general, the Martin arch tops are 31 through 42, after which they discontinued. But the F went on to be the basis for what Martin later called an M that they introduced in the 70s, and the basis also for the quadruple O size that here at Gruhn Guitars we have Martin make for us in considerable quantity in the custom shop. And I think that had they made a flat top in that size, I think they should have, but they didn't And if they had, it would be a great guitar that would do really, really well. John Parsons asks, is the ease of buying and selling used instruments online with websites like Reverb having a noticeable effect on new instrument sales across the industry? I personally am not seeing a tremendous impact on that, because not all companies want their guitars listed new on Reverb. Most of these companies, Martin, Gibson, Fender, they're called MAP price, minimum advertised price. They don't want them discounted below that on any advertisement. And they will actually penalize a dealer or even take their dealership away if they violate MAP policy. So Reverb certainly has an impact on the used instrument market, but again, most of the sellers on Reverb do not fall in the category I would call sufficiently trustworthy that I would take their word for what something is. I would want to trust but verify elsewhere. And I would never, ever, ever, ever buy a guitar online that had no approval privilege on it. If it is a non-refundable purchase, my strong advice is don't do that. Same person asks, does the Sinker mahogany neck and block on your custom Martins change their tone in any noticeable way? And the answer to that is, in our opinion, and the opinion of our customers, yes, it certainly does. There are some other dealers who've had custom Martins with sinker back and sides, but we have neck block, end block, and interior curved linings. And yes, we hear a difference. And no, I'm not aware of any other dealers who have that full package that we do on those guitars. There's a very limited amount of neck wood available, suitable for sinker necks, and Martin doesn't have enough to fill that need, and we order enough to use all that Martin has of that wood for the necks. Tom Van Tilburg, I was just wondering if there's ever been such a thing as a fretless bass guitar, and if so, are they still producing them? Are there any benefits as opposed to a fretted bass? Well, of course there are fretless basses. Fender, Ampeg, Tacoma, others have made them in acoustic and electric fretless basses that are still, you know, Fender, you can get a P bass or a jazz bass that's fretless. And Ampeg made fretless basses. Tacoma did. Numerous boutique builders do. And so, yes, there are fretted and fretless acoustic ones. And many makers have done them, and there is a significant difference in what you can do. Listen to any really good bass player who played on fretless and fretted. Most of them play fretless, also play fretted. Hear somebody like Jaco Pastorius would do on a fretless versus a fretted, and you can do slides and other half-tones, semitones that you wouldn't do so easily on a fretted bass, but it's a different thing. And for that matter, even upright basses, they're almost all fretless, but almost all is the term. There's a few fretted ones, and they sound different, and you do different things on them. So, yep, they are available. George Scanelli, I was looking at 3 different Martin guitar models, the D41, D42, and the D45. Putting the ornate features aside, these 3 guitars sound very similar to me. Do I understand that the price points are, I do understand the price points are different, so what are the main differences pertaining to sound and tone? Well, on the modern ones, if you get the standard line, D41, D42, and D45, the wood on the top, back, and sides, and neck, and fingerboard, and bridge is the same, and the bracing pattern's the same. So there is no reason why they should sound different. But if you get custom shop versions, or the Authentic Series version that has Adirondack spruce top with scallop bracing, well, that's different. And but these days, the standard D41, D42, and D45 all have scalloped forward shifted bracing, whether it's spruce top or not. Back in the 70s, the D41 and the D45 were both in production. The D42 wasn't, but the D41 and D45, different ornamentation, but structurally, they both had non-scallop bracing, Sitka spruce top, and they sounded essentially the same. So the answer is you're paying for ornamentation unless you get different wood. If you get a Adirondack spruce top versus a Sitka spruce top, sure enough, it's different. Or if you get a custom shop instrument that features rosewood other than Indian rosewood, also that is going to be different. Jeff Bullock, why do you think the Larson brothers chose not to put their name on their guitars? Well, both of the Larson brothers have one thing in common, that is they're dead. And I can't ask them. These boys died back before I was born. I was born in 1945. We don't know why they didn't put their name on, but they did make guitars for a variety of music stores and some distributors, as well as some that they just sold themselves. But their own brand was Mauer and Prairie State, and they actually had worked originally for Mauer and bought that company, bought the name back around 1902, and they continued using it. But they never did see fit to put their own name on guitars, and I do not know why. When I become omniscient, I'll let you know. Joe R. said, really excited about my new Sinker Martins that I procured from their shop over the past year. They are by far finest sounding and playing Martins I've ever heard. Could you give us any idea how the product started and your input into the process? Well, Jay Meyer, the local Martin sales rep who covers a 6-state area and is my rep, used to work at the factory as a wood buyer. He's the one I can credit for finding that wood and realizing that it would have a good potential. And he had a few custom shop D18s made, and he showed me one. I freaked out over how good it was. I ordered a bunch, but instead of just sticking to that, I added quadruple O in 14th fret and in 12th fret, and also 12 string, and we've done some with more ornamentation. So I expanded that line, and in doing so, I can say that those others are very much my babies, but Jay Meyer also deserves a great deal of credit, and without him, those models wouldn't exist. And so he turned me on to an idea, and then I expanded considerably on it. And I feel very fortunate to have been able to work with Jay Meyer and the Martin Company to expand that line, continue that line, which has been very successful for us. And they are some of the finest sounding new guitars I've ever had in my entire career. I'm very proud to have them. We have more questions that have come in than I'm able to get to finish for this week. However, I can say that I will cover the remaining questions in the next session. And I urge people to send in questions that don't necessarily have to be easy answers. The more challenging they are, including if you have disagreements with anything that I've said, I'd like to hear that. It always is ego flattering to have people agree with me, but I don't learn anything new when everybody agrees with everything that I say. If you have areas in which you think I'm either wrong or didn't cover it in sufficient detail, by all means, feel free to challenge me, because I'm not afraid of losing an intellectual debate. It feels good to win a debate, but you don't learn anything new. If somebody points out a genuine error, then I don't get angry. I'm thankful to learn that something I thought was in fact mistaken, and that at age 75, you know, I have a lot of notions that have become pretty firmly ingrained over the years, but it means that I do try to learn new things every day, and I'm old enough that in order to learn something new, I sometimes have to change a long-held opinion. I'm a firm believer in scientific method, and scientific method is such that everybody who is truly scientific in their thinking is always willing to change their mind when shown evidence to refute their long-held opinion. And some things that I know or think I know are in fact opinions. There is a difference between opinion and fact, but even things that you think you know so well that you believe them to be fact can in fact turn out to be wrong. For example, when Einstein's theory of relativity was introduced, a whole lot of people knew deep in their heart that light always travels in a straight line, and surely gravity wouldn't affect it. They were wrong, and they've been proven wrong. Well, as I said earlier, when I become omniscient, I'll let everybody know immediately. And I'll be really humble about it too. Actually, I don't even know if I'll be humble about it, because if I were omniscient, I might change opinions from what I have now. And I might no longer think that humility is a good thing if I were omniscient. I don't know that, but I don't really expect to become omniscient anytime soon. So by all means, please feel free to challenge me, because I genuinely enjoy and appreciate questions that cause me to have to really rethink opinions, or at least struggle to prove my own opinions. So I look forward to hearing more next week. Thank you for listening today.